10 poor man dinners from old Japan that disappeared forever. In 1887, a rice merchant in Edo, the city that would soon be renamed Tokyo and remade into the capital of a modernizing nation, wrote something in his daily ledger that historians have quoted rarely and understood incompletely. Between a column of prices and a note about a delayed shipment, he wrote, "The old ways of eating are ending. My grandfather would not recognize what my children put in their bowls. He was not lamenting the loss of quality. He was noting the loss of a specific kind of knowledge, the accumulated domestic intelligence of people who had lived close to scarcity for so long that they had developed an entire cuisine from it. A cuisine built not from abundance and choice, but from limitation and ingenuity. A cuisine that knew how to make the inside of a vegetable that everyone discarded taste like a complete meal. That knew how to ferment things that had no business fermenting into something that could sustain a family through winter. That knew the precise moment when a pot of thin gruel, if left alone long enough over a very low flame, transformed from poverty food into something worth eating with genuine attention. That cuisine was already disappearing in 1887. By 1950, most of it was gone. By now, only traces remain. In the memories of very old people, in the margins of agricultural records, in the diaries of Meiji-era journalists who sometimes stopped long enough in their enthusiasm for the new to record what was being left behind. Number 8 on this list was eaten by farmers across the Tohoku region for 300 years and has not been made by anyone living for at least 40. Number 5 required a preparation technique so labor-intensive that it was abandoned the moment a cheaper alternative became available, and the knowledge of how to do it correctly vanished within a single generation. Number 2 was the most common dinner in Japan for a period spanning roughly 4 centuries, and is now so completely forgotten that most contemporary Japanese food scholars, when shown the historical record of its existence, express genuine disbelief that it was ever eaten at all. These 10 dinners did not disappear because they failed. They disappeared because the world changed around them and left them behind. Relics of a relationship with food that modernity made unnecessary and prosperity made invisible. They are gone now, but they were real. And the people who ate them were real. And the intelligence that produced them accumulated across generations of ordinary people, managing the distance between what existed and what was needed, deserves to be remembered before the last thread connecting it to the present snaps entirely. Number 10. Haikaiu, millet porridge. Begin here because this is where Japanese food history actually begins. Not with rice, which arrived relatively late in the Japanese archipelago from the Asian continent and spent several centuries establishing the dominance it would eventually achieve, but with the grains that preceded it. Millet, hi and awa, 2 varieties cultivated in Japan since the Jomon period, roughly 14,000 years ago, was the daily staple of ordinary Japanese people across most of Japanese history, eaten by the rural poor who grew rice but could not afford to keep it, and by the urban poor who worked the cities that rice wealth was building but did not share in the wealth itself. Hikaiu was not rice porridge by another name. It was a different food entirely, grainier, earthier, possessed of a nutty depth that polished white rice entirely lacks, and that the people who ate it for 50 years of their lives recognized as the taste of food rather than the taste of status. The porridge was made by simmering millet in 3 to 4 times its volume of water over low heat, until the grains swelled and the lick thickened into a cohesion that held the spoon's mark for a moment before settling. Salt and whatever vegetables or dried fish the household possessed completed the bowl. Millet contains more protein than rice, more fat, more fiber, and a more complete amino acid profile. People who ate it as their daily staple were, by the nutritional evidence, eating better than the upper classes who ate white rice and developed the deficiency diseases that polished grain produces. They did not know this. They knew that hai was peasant food and rice was something else, and when modernization and agricultural transformation made rice accessible to the rural poor for the first time in Japanese history, they abandoned the millet with a thoroughness that nutritional reasoning alone cannot explain. They abandoned it because they could. The freedom to stop eating haikaiu was the first concrete evidence that the old relationship with scarcity was ending. By 1920, millet porridge had become rare enough in Japanese cities to be considered a curiosity. By 1960, it had become an agricultural relic. The fields that had grown it for millennia were planted with rice and then with other things. The millet seed stock preserved in agricultural gene banks by researchers who understood that the disappearance of a cultivated variety is permanent in a way that the disappearance of a recipe is not quite. The recipe disappeared too. Number 9. Hoba miso, dried magnolia leaf miso. In the mountain regions of central Japan, Gifu, Nagano, the high valleys of what is now called the Japanese Alps, a cooking technique developed that was specific to the environment in a way that could not survive transplantation to other places or other conditions. Hoba, the large dried leaves of the Japanese magnolia tree, were used as cooking vessels placed directly over the embers of the irori, the central hearth that was the heart of a traditional Japanese farmhouse, with miso and vegetables, and occasionally a scrap of preserved fish arranged on the leaf's surface. The leaf served multiple functions simultaneously. It was the pan that made direct contact with the heat. It was the flavoring agent, the dried magnolia releasing a faint, slightly bitter, aromatic compound into the miso as it heated that no other vessel produced. It was the plate from which the meal was eaten directly, with rice held in the other hand. The contrast between the hot leaf and the warm rice and the dark, caramelized miso on the leaf's surface constituting the complete texture and flavor experience of the meal. The irori hearth that made hoba miso possible was the architectural feature of the traditional Japanese farmhouse that modernization most efficiently eliminated. When gas cooking arrived in the mountain communities of central Japan in the early 20th century, the irori was sealed or removed, and the hoba miso that had been made over its embers for generations lost its heat source. Gas burners could approximate the cooking, but could not replicate the atmosphere, the embers, the ash, the low, radiating heat that the leaf required to release its oils slowly rather than scorching immediately. Some mountain restaurants in Gifu Prefecture serve hoba miso today over gas flames at tourist prices. The leaf is genuine. The technique is approximately correct. What is missing is the irori and the farmhouse and the winter evening and the 300 years of accumulated knowledge about exactly how hot the embers should be and how long the leaf should sit before the miso at the edges begins to caramelize and the center is still soft. Number 8. Hikage no Kazunoko smoked herring roe gruel. In the coastal communities of Tohoku, the northeastern region of Japan, where the cold Pacific current brings fish in quantities that the warmer waters of the south cannot match, herring arrived in autumn runs of such density that the fish were harvested in numbers that exceeded the community's immediate capacity to eat them. The solution was preservation in forms that could be distributed across the year: salt curing, drying, smoking, and fermentation in combinations that varied by community and by family, and by the specific knowledge of the women who managed the household's winter food supply. Kazunoko, herring roe, was the most abundant byproduct of autumn herring processing. The cured, dried roe was a traditional New Year delicacy that has survived into the contemporary Japanese food market, sold at prices that reflect its ceremonial status rather than its historical commonness. But the smoked roe of the Tohoku poor, the roe that was not set aside for New Year ceremony, but was eaten through the winter in gruel, crumbled into thin millet or rice porridge as the primary protein of the daily meal, has no contemporary market and no contemporary memory. Hikage no Kazunoko, literally shadow roe, the roe that never reached the ceremonial table, was smoked over cedar and dried grass until the exterior developed a dark, resinous crust and the interior remained dense and intensely flavored. Crumbled into gruel, a small amount provided the taste of the sea and a significant quantity of omega-3 fatty acids and complete protein to a meal that without it was almost purely starch. Families in the fishing villages of Tohoku ate it from November through March every year for at least 300 years. The last documented reference to Hikage no Kazunoko as a regular household food appears in a 1931 agricultural survey of coastal Miyagi Prefecture. The surveyor noted it as an old-fashioned practice that the younger generation had abandoned in favor of purchased canned goods. The industrial food economy having arrived in the fishing villages with the same efficiency with which it was arriving everywhere else, offering convenience at the cost of the accumulated knowledge that the older practice contained. By 1960, no one was making it. By 1980, no one living remembered eating it. The knowledge of how to smoke and dry the roe in the specific way that produced the specific flavor, the cedar smoke, the duration, the temperature management over an open fire in a cold coastal shed went with the generation that carried it. Number 7. Kori Dofu Jiru, freeze-dried tofu soup. Kori Dofu, freeze-dried tofu produced by the natural winter temperatures of Japanese mountain regions through a process of freezing and thawing repeated over multiple days until all moisture had been expelled, and what remained was a spongy, lightweight block of concentrated soybean protein that could survive months of storage without refrigeration, was a military ration, a temple food, and a poor man's dinner across several centuries of Japanese history before industrial refrigeration made the traditional production method obsolete and industrial food manufacturing made the product available year-round at prices that eliminated the incentive to make it at home. The home production of Kori Dofu required conditions that were available naturally in mountain regions for roughly 3 months of the year. The nights cold enough to freeze the tofu thoroughly, the days warm enough to allow partial thawing, the wind dry enough to assist moisture expulsion rather than reintroducing it. Families in the mountain communities of Nagano, Gifu, and Yamagata produced Kori Dofu annually in quantities sufficient to last through the year. The production timed to the specific winter conditions that made it possible and managed by women who understood the process through decades of personal practice rather than through any written instruction. The soup made from Kori Dofu, rehydrated in dashi, the spongy block having absorbed the broth until it was dense with flavor rather than with moisture, tasted different from any soup made from fresh tofu. The texture was more complex, slightly chewy at the exterior and yielding at the center. The flavor was more concentrated, the soybean protein having been restructured by the freeze-drying process into something that absorbed broth more completely than the original tofu. The soup was deeply satisfying in the particular way of foods that have been worked for. That required the winter and the specific cold and the daily management of the drying frames and the patience of weeks before they were ready. Industrial Kori Dofu replaced the home-produced variety entirely by the 1950s. The commercial product is technically identical in its preparation method. What it lacks is the specificity of place, the particular winter of a particular mountain valley in a particular year, absorbed into the block during its outdoor drying, which made every household's Kori Dofu slightly different from every other household's and deeply connected to the specific environment that produced it. The commercial product tastes of Kori Dofu. The home-produced variety tasted of home. Number 6, Imonoko Jiru, small taro shoulder soup. Here is the dish that reveals how completely the traditional Japanese diet operated on principles of total use that contemporary cooking has entirely abandoned. Imonoko, the small secondary tubers that grow clustered around the base of the taro plant, too small to be considered the primary harvest, typically left in the ground or discarded during processing, were the specific ingredient of this Tohoku regional soup. The primary taro harvest went to market or to the household's main cooking. The imonoko were what remained. Dozens of small, irregular tubers, ranging from the size of a large marble to the size of a small egg, attached in clusters to the base of the plant that had already been taken. Harvesting them required the decision that they were worth harvesting, which required the knowledge that they were food, which required the continuity of a culinary tradition that understood the taro plant completely rather than selectively. Imonoko jiru was made by simmering the small tubers in miso broth with seasonal vegetables, burdock, carrot, whatever grew in the kitchen garden, until the taro clusters softened and the starch from their surfaces thickened the broth into a body that thin vegetable soup never achieved. The small size of the imonoko meant that each piece absorbed the miso broth all the way through rather than remaining starchy and bland at the center, producing a soup in which every element had received the broth completely. The dish was specific to the Tohoku autumn, a seasonal preparation tied to the taro harvest, made when the imonoko were fresh, eaten within the agricultural community that produced them. When agricultural modernization changed the relationship between food producer and food consumer, when the people eating the taro were no longer the people harvesting it, the imonoko were no longer retrieved from the ground because no one who encountered them in their post-harvest form knew what they were or that they were worth retrieving. They became agricultural waste, which is what things become when the knowledge that makes them food is lost. Second pattern break. Here's the thread that connects every dish on this list, the quality they share that explains both why they existed and why they disappeared. These meals were products of specific knowledge applied to specific materials in specific places. The smoked roe required knowing how to smoke roe. The freeze-dried tofu required the mountain winter and the knowledge of how to use it. The imonoko soup required knowing that the small tubers left in the ground were food. The millet porridge required the accumulated cooking knowledge of how to make millet taste like more than poverty. The hoba miso required the irori hearth and the dried magnolia leaves and the knowledge of exactly when the miso at the edges had reached the right stage of caramelization. None of this knowledge was written down. It was transmitted through practice, through children watching parents, through apprenticeship in the kitchen that began before formal education and continued across the decades of a cooking life. It was the kind of knowledge that requires proximity and repetition and time to acquire, and that disappears completely when the transmission chain is broken by a single generation that does not transmit, because the conditions that made the knowledge necessary have changed. Modernity broke the transmission chain simultaneously across the entire Japanese archipelago, through urbanization, through industrial food supply, through the cultural messaging that associated traditional poor food with backwardness and poverty, rather than with ingenuity and resilience. The generation that could have transmitted this knowledge chose, reasonably and understandably, not to do so. They wanted their children to eat better than they had. Better, in the modernizing Japan of the early 20th century, meant rice, and then bread, and then Western food, and then convenience food. The sequential abandonment of everything that the old knowledge had been built to manage. What was lost was not merely recipes. It was a way of understanding food as something that required knowledge and attention, and the willingness to use every part of everything available. That understanding is not recoverable from the industrial food system that replaced it. It can only be recovered from the people who still carry it, and those people are very old now, and they are leaving, and the knowledge is going with them. Number 5, Nuka Miso Zuke Jiru, rice bran ferment soup. The preparation technique in this entry was abandoned the moment a cheaper and simpler alternative became available, and the knowledge of how to perform it correctly vanished within the single generation that made the abandonment. That generation is now either very old or gone. What remains of the technique exists in fragments, in agricultural records, in the marginalia of Meiji-era domestic manuals, in the recalled observations of people who watched their grandmothers perform the process without understanding what they were watching. Nuka miso zuke was the practice of fermenting vegetables in a bed of rice bran and miso and salt for periods ranging from overnight to several months, depending on the desired outcome and the ambient temperature of the fermentation environment. This practice has survived in simplified form as nuka zuke, bran pickles, which remains a recognized if declining element of Japanese home cooking. What has not survived is the further step of using the spent fermentation bed itself as a soup base. The nuka miso bed, after months of active fermentation, accumulates the concentrated flavors of every vegetable that has passed through it. The liquid released by the vegetables, the metabolic products of the fermentation cultures, the transformed bran and miso that have been worked by the bacteria into a paste of extraordinary complexity. This paste, diluted with water and strained, produced a broth of fermented depth that no single ingredient could replicate. Vegetables simmered in this broth for the final soup absorbed flavors that their plain forms could never have achieved. The preparation required understanding the fermentation bed as a living system, requiring management over months and years, reading its smell and color and texture to determine its health, adjusting salt and temperature to maintain the balance of cultures, knowing when it had reached the stage at which its liquid was ready to be used as a soup base. This knowledge took years to develop through practice. It could not be learned from a recipe. It required the specific apprenticeship of a daughter watching her mother manage the same bed through multiple seasons, understanding the process by accumulation rather than by instruction. When the mother's generation stopped passing it on, the knowledge stopped. The beds went cold. The soup that required them became as inaccessible as the winters that produced the kori tofu and the forests that produced the magnolia leaves and the fishing sheds that produced the smoked roe. Not because the materials had disappeared, because the knowledge of how to use them had. Number 4, akameshi kayu, red rice gruel. Before white rice became the aspirational food of the Japanese poor and the daily food of the Japanese middle class, before polishing technology made white rice affordable for ordinary households, before the color of the grain in the bowl became a reliable indicator of the social position of the person eating it, red rice was the rice. Akameshi, red rice made from unpolished grain mixed with red beans or simply from the naturally reddish varieties of rice that predate modern agricultural selection, was the daily staple of ordinary Japanese people as most of Japanese recorded history. Akameshi kayu, red rice gruel, extended the same grain further with water, producing the stretched porridge that the poor ate when the red rice itself was insufficient. The color was distinctive. The reddish brown of the unpolished grain and the red beans giving the gruel a warmth that white rice porridge never achieved. The taste was deeper and more complex than white rice porridge, the bran layer of the unpolished grain contributing fat and fiber, and the nutty complexity that polishing removes entirely. Red rice is still produced in Japan as a ceremonial food, served at celebrations, at New Year, at significant occasions. The ceremony has preserved the color while erasing the poverty. Contemporary Japanese encountering akameshi at a wedding or a festival celebration are eating, in a refined and expensive form, the daily gruel of their ancestors, without any awareness of the distance between the ceremonial version and the survival version, or of the fact that the survival version was eaten every day for centuries by people who would have been astonished and possibly amused by the transformation of their daily staple into a luxury that signifies good fortune. The gruel form, akameshi kayu, has no ceremonial version. It was too humble for the transformation that saved the rice from total irrelevance. It simply disappeared when the people who ate it were able to stop eating it. Number 3, tofu no okara nabe, soybean pulp complete pot. The preparation at number 3 requires some introduction because its disappearance is so complete that reconstructing it from the available historical record requires inference as much as documentation. What the records show is a dish that appeared in Edo period household accounts and agricultural diaries as a winter staple of the urban and rural poor. A one-pot preparation that used okara, the soybean pulp remaining after tofu pressing, as its primary ingredient combined with whatever vegetables and dried protein the household possessed. What makes this entry different from the okara preparations mentioned elsewhere in Japanese food history is its completeness. The surviving descriptions indicate a preparation in which the okara was not merely an adulterant or extender of other ingredients, but the primary substance of the meal, cooked with enough dashi and miso and dried vegetable to produce something that was understood and eaten as a complete dinner rather than as a supplement or a stretch. The technique required managing okara's tendency to absorb liquid aggressively and to scorch against the bottom of a hot pot. Problems that contemporary cooks who occasionally work with okara encounter and solve with modern non-stick surfaces and controlled heat. Traditional cooks solve them with clay pots over carefully managed charcoal fires, the heat low enough and the liquid sufficient enough to prevent scorching and produce a pot that was moist and dense and possessed of the fermented depth that miso and the long contact time of slow cooking produced. By the Meiji period, the dish had become associated with a level of poverty that the rapidly modernizing Japanese middle class was anxious to distance itself from. The Meiji-era domestic manuals that documented so many aspects of traditional Japanese home cooking skipped over okaranabe with the thoroughness of deliberate omission, the silence in the record where a dish should appear being as telling as the presence of the dish itself. It was erased not by obsolescence, but by shame, which is a different kind of disappearance, and in some ways, a more complete one. Number 2. Moromi, fermenting mash eaten before it became soy sauce. Here is the dish that contemporary Japanese food scholars express disbelief about when shown the historical record. Moromi, the fermenting mash of soybeans and wheat from which soy sauce is eventually pressed, was eaten directly as a food in its own right by the Japanese poor across a period spanning at least 4 centuries, not as a byproduct or an accident, as a dinner. Soy sauce production in traditional Japan was a slow process conducted in large wooden vats over periods of 1 to 3 years. The moromi mash, dark, intensely flavored, still actively fermenting, possessed of the full flavor complexity that the pressing process would eventually extract and dilute into the finished sauce, sat in those vats for months before it was pressed. During those months, it was accessible to the workers in the soy sauce breweries, to the poor families who lived in the neighborhoods surrounding them, and to the agricultural communities where small-scale soy sauce production occurred alongside food growing. Moromi eaten directly, spooned from the vat, served over rice or gruel, consumed as the sole flavoring and protein in an otherwise plain bowl, provided glutamates, amino acids, and fermentation products in concentrations that finished soy sauce, diluted to pourable consistency, never delivers. Number 1. Shiomizu meshi, salt water rice. The meal at number 1 is the simplest on this list. It is the simplest because it is the most extreme, the point at which frugality has been reduced to its irreducible minimum, and what remains is a bare fact about what human beings will do when the alternative to a meal is no meal. Rice cooked in salt water with nothing else. No dashi, no miso, no vegetable. No preserved fish or fermented soybean or dried seaweed or any of the other ingredients that the poor man's kitchen was built to manage with ingenuity. Only rice, water, and salt, the 3 elements present in almost every human kitchen in almost every period of human history, the universal minimum from which every cuisine in the world has departed and to which certain cuisines, under certain conditions, have been forced to return. Shiomushi meshi. The historical record uses several related terms, appears consistently in accounts of Japanese poverty from the medieval period through the early 20th century as the meal eaten when everything else had been consumed, sold, or become unavailable. The rice merchant's grandfather ate it. The Tohoku farmer ate it in the years between bad harvests. The Edo laborer ate it at the end of a week when the wages had not stretched to anything additional. The wartime family ate it when the ration had been spent and the black market was beyond reach, and the foraging had yielded nothing, and the pot held only what the water and the salt and the rice could provide. It tasted of rice and salt, nothing more. Contemporary Japanese food writers who have eaten it experimentally describe it as surprisingly complete, the salt bringing out the sweetness of the rice, the texture of well-cooked grain against the palate, the warmth of the bowl in the hands. These are the observations of people eating it by choice in a kitchen with other options available as an exercise in historical understanding. The observation that it is surprisingly complete is the observation of someone who expected inadequacy and found sufficiency. The people who ate it in the conditions that produced it were not experiencing it as surprising. They were experiencing it as dinner. The irreducible minimum that remained when everything the poor man's kitchen had accumulated across centuries of ingenuity and necessity had been spent, and what remained was the grain and the water and the salt and the decision to call it enough. That decision, made by millions of ordinary people across 4 centuries of Japanese history, sitting over bowls of saltwater rice in circumstances that had left them nothing else, is the foundation on which everything else on this list was built. It is the baseline from which every other act of culinary ingenuity on this list was a departure. It is the answer to the question that poverty asks every single day. What do you do when there is almost nothing? You put the almost nothing in the pot. You add water and salt, you wait, you eat, and then you try to do better tomorrow. These 10 dinners are gone. The people who made them are gone. The conditions that required them are gone, which is, on balance, the correct thing to celebrate, even as we mourn the knowledge that the conditions produced. What do you think was lost when these meals disappeared? Just the recipes, or something more? Leave your answer in the comments. And if you have ever made something from almost nothing in a kitchen that had very little for people who needed it, tell us what was in the pot. That story belongs here.